Hey everyone, welcome in. Thanks for joining us. We'll get started in a couple minutes. Good morning. Good morning, Michael. I'm glad you were able to join us. See Allie Neal. Oh, see you at our conference. Who else do we got? Like I see so many names that we know. Bobby Lee. Hey, Carla. We're going to go ahead and get started because we just have such a short hour with Michelle Price. We want to make the best time of it here with everyone. If you want to put in the chat box just where you're from, and also one thing that you might want to get out of today, that'll help us for today and just down the road as well. So you are in the session that is the demand in human trafficking. We're so excited to have our speaker today, Michelle Price. She works with she is the Human Trafficking Compliance Officer of the Human Trafficking Unit within the Victims Assistance Division at the Georgia Criminal Justice Coordinating Council. So probably like many of you, under an umbrella, many different names there. So CJCC. Michelle assists in the coordination and assessment of the design and implementation of the programs administered by the Human Trafficking Unit. And this includes the Georgia Coalition to Combat Human Trafficking and the Innovative Prosecution Solutions for Combating Violent Crimes. She is also the chair of the work group focused on deterring traffickers and buyers in the state of Georgia for their task force. And so welcome, Michelle. And I want to let you guys know I will be keeping track of your questions in the chat box or using the Q&A. And I'm going to hold them to the end just to make sure we have enough time for her to get everything through. But I'm going to hand it off to you, Michelle.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Shel, for that introduction. Good morning, everyone. As Shel mentioned, my name is Michelle Price, and I am very honored to be with you all this morning. It feels like there is hardly a room that you can walk into or a table that you can sit at where trafficking is not discussed or at least mentioned. And I believe at this point, we can all agree that human trafficking is an issue that needs to be addressed. But before we get into how to address human trafficking, let's review what it is. So human trafficking is an umbrella term, usually and generally used to describe the varying forms of exploitation of human beings. Simply put, it is the recruitment, harboring, transportation, provision, or obtaining of a person for a commercial sex act, labor, or services by way of force, fraud, or coercion. Of course, we know in cases of commercial sexual exploitation of a minor, there need to show the element of the use of force, fraud, or coercion is not necessary because a child legally cannot consent to a commercial sex act. The Trafficking Victims Act of 2000, or the TVPA, is the first comprehensive federal statute to address trafficking in persons and became the national framework for the federal response to human trafficking. It uses a three-pronged approach that includes protection, prevention, and prosecution. It authorized the establishment of the State Department's office to monitor and combat trafficking in persons, and the President's Interagency Task Force to monitor and combat trafficking in persons. Both assist in the coordination of anti-trafficking efforts and also establish victim protections and clarifies that anyone, literally anyone, can be a victim of human trafficking, whether you're a woman, man, adult, child, citizen, and non-citizens alike. Also in 2000, the protocol to prevent, suppress, and punish trafficking in persons was adopted by United Nations. You may have heard of it referred to as the Palermo Protocol, and that is because the adoption occurred in Palermo, Italy. But the protocol is made up of 20 articles, and the purpose of this protocol was to prevent and combat trafficking in persons, particularly paying attention to women and children, to protect and assist the victims of such trafficking with full respect of their human rights, and to promote cooperation among states in order to meet those objectives. Though it is made of 20 articles, we will only focus on Article 9.5, which focuses on prevention of trafficking in persons. Now, in conversations about trafficking, there's always the question, what does a victim look like? Who are the buyers? Who are the traffickers? And where does the trafficking occur? And the response is always the same. There is no box. It's actually dangerous to try to put it in a box because human trafficking is a crime that does not discriminate. There are indicators and commonalities, yes, but anyone can be trafficked. Anyone can be a trafficker. Trafficking can literally occur anywhere. And then this is where you bring in the A&P model, and then it all makes sense, right? And don't forget, of course, force, fraud, and coercion is not necessary when we're talking about minors. So, although there is still much to learn and still so much to be done, despite all the great effort, increased awareness and outreach, stronger or new legislation, harsher penalties, increase in training, availability and access to resources, and collaboration driven by the overall desire to see an end, human trafficking continues to grow steadily. Why is that? Because as of 2014, traffickers are profiting $150 billion annually. I personally remember when the International Labor Organization reported 32 million, and that was in 2005. But we'll get to numbers a little bit later. And then one day, I literally sat and thought to myself, why is that? And if you know me, that can be dangerous because I'm known for traveling far down rabbit holes. But back to the question, literally, why is that? And then I realized that this is not only the question, but also the answer. It's the why. To traffickers, human trafficking is not a victimization, but a business, rather an illicit industry. And like in business, this illicit industry thrives when they have strong markets. Well, a market is created when there is a demand for a good or service, and someone guarantees that the good or service is supplied for a profit. Now, how does that translate in the human trafficking market? That is the conversation this morning. Referring back to the Palermo Protocol, Article 9, it reads, states parties shall adopt or strengthen legislative or other measures such as educational, social, or cultural measures, including through bilateral and multilateral cooperation to discourage the demand that fosters all forms of exploitation of persons, especially women and children, that leads to trafficking. Basically, in the human trafficking market, there are levels to demand. There is the demand for trafficking, the demand for exploitation, and the demand that fosters the exploitation that leads to trafficking. And to illustrate this, I reverse engineered the AMP model. And here we have the PMA model. You'll see written out, but separated in the areas of purpose, means, and action are the final words of the obligation of Article 9(5), and that is to discourage the demand that fosters all exploitation that leads to trafficking. Then written in description where each level of demand fits in the reverse model. So when you're talking about purpose of the reverse AMP model, it's referring to the demand of the consumer or buyer for commercial and cheap labor services, commercial sex and cheap labor services. It is within the means that we refer to the areas of demand for exploitation, where force, fraud, and coercion occur and vulnerabilities are capitalized. Then it is in the action where it refers to the demand for trafficking, which follows the recruitment, harboring, transportation, provision, obtaining, patronizing, soliciting, or advertising of a person that generates the supply, which then will transfer you back into human trafficking, the victimization. But here is where we're honing in on human trafficking and looking at it as a market. So traffickers feed the demand for trafficking because it is the acts of recruitment, harboring, transportation, provision, or obtaining of individuals they will exploit through force, fraud, or coercion that provide the commercial sex and cheap labor services that buyers pay for. The demand for exploitation exists because it is in varying situations of exploitation where traffickers can access the supply to fulfill their role in the demand for trafficking that leads to human trafficking, the victimization. And I really hope you got that. The demand that fosters the exploitation that leads to trafficking that exists because we live in a society that demands cheap labor and commercial sex, and that is fueled by buyers. It's the cycle that you will see here. That needs to be broken. And we must break this connection. But how do we affect a market where supply and demand are the same thing? Human beings, right? That is the question. prevention and intervention that reduce demand by deterring buyers and traffickers. Now, to prevent the occurrence of something or continued occurrence of something, we have to pull it from the root. So what do we know? The human trafficking market is fueled by the economic principles of supply and demand and distribution. And again, we live in a society that demands cheap labor and commercial sex. High demand drives the high volume of supply, and increasing demand from consumers for cheap goods incentivizes corporations to demand cheap labor. Increased demand for commercial sex incentivizes commercial sex venues and includes strip clubs, pornography, and prostitution to recruit and exploit children and create opportunities for traffickers to exploit in other industries. Sustaining the market is the systemic inequality and disparity that leave marginalized populations vulnerable to exploitation. Consider the exclusionary practices that prevent certain communities from attaining financial stability. This only gives traffickers space and opportunity to offer tempting but potentially harmful alternative options. Traffickers choose targets based on their vulnerability, and they use recruitment or enticement tactics and methods of control that will most effectively work. So let's take a look at some of the statistics. So at any given time in 2016, an estimated 40.3 million people were in modern slavery and 24.9 million in forced labor, the other 15.4 million in forced marriage. And just for context, the forced labor number, this is international. However, it does include sex and labor within that number of the 24.9. So out of the 24.9 people that were forced in labor, 4.8 million of those persons were forced in sexual exploitation. 1 in 4 victims of modern slavery are children. Then we have women and girls who are disproportionately affected by trafficking. They account for 99% of victims in the commercial sexual industry. You have victims of any age or immigration status that live anywhere, that 70 to 90% are exploited children who have a history of sexual abuse. We have 60% of victims who reported that they are runaway. And it's been reported that 48% of victims who engaged in commercial sexual activity was because they had a lack of place to sleep. Then you have the LGBTQ community, where 44% in comparison to 34% of their straight peers experience a trafficking situation. 26% of LGBTQIA plus youth in relation to 12% of their straight peers experience commercial sexual exploitation while homeless. And then you have 63% of youth who have involvement in the child welfare system. And then this is a real life example and a testimonial well, not a testimonial, but the story of someone who was actually within foster care and found themselves within a trafficking situation, feeling that they were only wanted when money was involved and were easily recruited for that purpose. So we also know that the human trafficking market is sustained by the results of high profit reward and is combined with that minimal, low cost, low risk. The $150 billion annual profit I previously mentioned, broken down by profit and sector, showed that 99 billion of those profits were from commercial sexual exploitation. That's about 66%. And if you recall, an estimated 19% of human trafficking victims are exploited for sex. 21% of that 19% were children. And not to devalue or shift focus from any other sector of exploitation, but when less than 1/4 of victims generate over half of the profit in a market, it really speaks to the strength of the demand for this type of service and prices buyers are willing to pay. So these charts actually break down the net profit per person by sector of exploitation and by region per one person. As you can see, sexual exploitation definitely exceeded all of the other sectors when you look at the price per thousands. And it did the same for developing countries when you looked at it by region. Going back to the low risk and minimal fear of punishment or legal consequence, the number of prosecutions are shockingly low for an industry that victimizes millions around the world. The global law enforcement data, in order to fully meet the TVPA's minimum standards for the elimination of trafficking, specifically for tier 1 companies, the 2003 reauthorization of the TVPA added a requirement to the law that governments provide the Department of State with data on trafficking investigations, prosecutions, convictions, and sentences. It was the 2004 report that this data was first collected, and in 2007, as you can see, this is where they actually began to separate the numbers of total prosecutions and convictions that related to labor trafficking specifically. And those are the numbers that you see represented within the parentheses. So thinking back to the charge in Article 9.5 of the Palermo Protocol and how it can be understood or fulfilled with the reverse AMP model, what can this application look like? And this is just a suggestion. Even if they don't look at legislative measures, the obligation of the states to adopt or strengthen any one of these measures, it's optional which one, but they have to do something, right? So an example of strengthening legislative measures: criminalization of all sex buying, regardless of knowing the use of trafficking victims. Now, most states' current legislation will criminalize the knowing of the use of trafficking victims. This addresses the reduction of demand for trafficking, which has the smallest impact to demand reduction. And with the low conviction, the low risk of conviction, low cost and high profit elements that can overpower the potential deterrence. Plus, when you consider that most buyers are not even concerned when distinguishing between paying for sex from a sex worker versus paying for sex from a victim of exploitation. This can potentially do one of two things. It can either deter or discourage a buyer from purchasing sex simply for fear of punishment, which is the most impactful. Then it can result in the concurrent reduction of the lower levels of demand. And even if the criminalizing of all sex buying, regardless of the knowing, there is the use of trafficking that can do something else, which is send a message on what is an acceptable norm. So really the hope is that when we understand how to discourage the demands that fosters all forms of exploitation that leads to trafficking, you're really looking at the reducing the demand that refers to where our society is actually demanding that cheap sex and that commercial or the commercial sex and cheap labor, and also concurrently reducing all the other forms of exploitation or the demand for exploitation and the demand for trafficking that leads to the actual victimization of trafficking. And I will say credit to Georgia for incorporating the limited defense. Now, what does that look like when you take the same concept and apply it when considered to the demand to buy and sell material online and how the effects of COVID causing a dependency on computer access from youth that created an opportunity for traffickers to groom and recruit through the chat or DM functions of social media in order to reduce or produce online sexually exploitative material that would then be sold on the same platforms where pornography would be bought and sold. How do you address the demand for online sexual material before a trafficker is able to exploit the effects of the pandemic and the increased dependency on technology that can lead to the online sexual exploitation of a child? Because traffickers quickly adapted to and exploited vulnerabilities related to COVID-19. Human traffickers targeted the growing number of people unable to mitigate, adapt to, or build resilience against the worsening economic and social effects. And they also exploited situations where screening and the identification of victims became really difficult. The US National Center for Missing and Exploited Children reported a 98.66% increase in online enticement and reports between January and September 2020 compared to the same period in 2019. And also the reports to the cyber tip line doubled to 1.6 million. Now, over the past few months, maybe more, there was really an increase in the need of technology, and there's prolonged access to technology that traffickers were able to meet the increased demand for OSEM, which is the online sexual exploitation material, and exploit various platforms to recruit for and facilitate online sexual exploitation. one that where most people are very familiar with is probably OnlyFans. And they really use those Messenger and the DM options within Facebook and Instagram, and then Snapchat to really reach out and to recruit these youth into basically developing this material that would be posted for online sexual exploitation. Now, one strategy that we could have incorporated in that would be the chat box disruptions. And that could have been a strategy to really educate on the harms of creating and disseminating online sexual exploitative material. Now, over the past few sessions, Georgia has really moved forward in big ways to strengthen or adopt new legislation. For example, House Bill 281 that substantially increased penalties for buying or selling adults for sex, or Senate Bill 823. And that marks anyone anyone that is convicted of human trafficking from getting a commercial driver's license, or Senate Bill 28 that updated the mandated reporter law to include both those who were victimized by labor and sex trafficking. There's also the Safe Harbor law that not only established the Safe Harbor Commission, but the Safe Harbor Fund that is grown by fines and of convicted traffickers, and the state operation assessment on adult entertainment businesses. And in conjunction with the Safe Harbor law that was required was the creation of the statewide service delivery plan. And this was intended to be a broad and comprehensive compilation of the services, resources, and responses needed by the state to address the complexities of human trafficking. In addition, we had Senate Bill 158, which is entitled the Anti-Human Trafficking Protective Response Act. And it requires that a law enforcement agency or agency DFACS to require any child suspected of being a victim of sexual exploitation or trafficking under Code 16546 to an available victim assistance organization as certified by the Criminal Justice Coordinating Council. Additional safeguards are provided against human trafficking. And DFACS really was able to take a more active role in the supervision of children who are victims of human trafficking. Certified organizations provide comprehensive trauma-informed services designed to alleviate the adverse effects of the trafficking victimization and to aid in the child's healing, such as assistance with case management, residential care or placement, access to education and legal services, as well as mental health services. Now, working in partnerships to improve collaboration, build the knowledge base, maximize the benefit of shared expertise, and improve the service response is always at the forefront in every initiative in the state of Georgia. And the Georgia Statewide Human Trafficking Task Force is no exception. Consists of 9 working groups illustrated, and each one really plays a role in developing initiatives that aim to protect the citizens of Georgia from perpetrators and systems of sexual exploitation, while concurrently working to support recovery of adults and victims of all forms of exploitation to ensure that they are ready for college, work, and a successful future. For example, The Child Abuse and Exploitation Technical Assistance Resource Guide that was created by Workgroup 2 that focuses on keeping youth aware and safe makes specific program recommendations that really equip schools to comply with Senate Bill 401 and specifically address child abuse and exploitation within sexual violence, the sexual violence continuum, and how communities can engage in prevention strategies to improve the health and well-being of their youth population. There's also Workgroup 3 that I chair, whose aim is to specifically deter buyers and traffickers. To break the business of human trafficking and deter buyers and traffickers, we must disrupt the supply, right? And demand really to increase and or decrease the profitability so that it is no longer worth it. Now, Workgroup 3 is working to develop a program. It's called Mindset Against Trafficking and Exploitation, also known as the MATE program. Its purpose to define human trafficking as a public health issue and highlight the many harms of human trafficking and exploitation, an effort to shift individuals' desires to participate in exploitative activities, but also to attempt to identify the different elements in society and culture that create environments where exploitation is tolerated on any level. The hope for outcome is to decrease the demand for commercial sex and cheap labor. We are also planning to develop a toolkit or a guide for various community programs on how to create larger impact in reducing the risk to human trafficking that economic vulnerabilities can bring, utilizing a 2-generation and whole generation approach. The result hoped for is that a reduction in the power of vulnerabilities traffickers use to exploit individuals will lead to a reduction in the supply. If this workshop piqued your interest or aligns with your area of study or expertise, consider becoming a member of the task force. Open enrollment is set to begin around October, and we would love to have your mind at the table to develop and carry out the various initiatives for the state. Now, in an effort to improve law enforcement's response and ensure that they have the resources needed, the Georgia Coalition to Combat Human Trafficking was developed. And this is Georgia's first state-level law enforcement-based task force utilizing the enhanced collaborative model. It creates a strategic partnership with GBI and selected victim service providers that address areas of adult, child, and labor trafficking, as well as sex trafficking, in order to provide a more comprehensive response to sex trafficking for adults and minors and labor trafficking within the state. The goal is to create a unified, trauma-informed, and comprehensive response to all forms of human trafficking in Georgia so that victims are safe and offenders are essentially held accountable. Now, the Georgia Coalition to Combat Human Trafficking aims to build and maintain strategic partnerships through targeted outreach for its purpose. And in case you're wondering, I'll take just a moment to really explain the difference. While the statewide task force focuses on human trafficking response as a whole, strategically addressing each element of the human trafficking continuum, the Georgia Coalition to Combat Human Trafficking focuses on supporting law enforcement's role in human trafficking investigations and really collaborating with prosecutors and social assistance agencies to create a multidisciplinary approach, but will leverage the statewide trafficking task force when applicable. Also hold offenders accountable and ensure those who have experienced human trafficking and exploitation in any form are supported and safe. From the Georgia Coalition to Combat Human Trafficking Initiative came the Human Trafficking Data Clearinghouse. And this was created to provide our partners with access to pertinent data in real time, and really to highlight areas where proactive investigations can occur and preventative measures rather can be taken. As an incredibly complex issue, there was a hotline that was created that will allow the state of Georgia. The hotline is 1-866 HTGA, and it really allows the state of Georgia to access resources as it relates to human trafficking. And when you use this hotline, it functions as a phone tree that will connect you to the different partners and the different agencies that do address adult sex, child sex trafficking, can provide resources, the GBI hotline, as well as organizations such as Tapestry for labor trafficking and foreign-born, and then as well as the adult trafficking hotline. And we also have a website, which is www.htga.org. Now, again, as we look at the Palermo Protocol and what it really has charged us to do is take a look at the different strategies for decreasing the demand that leads to exploitative situations that can lead to trafficking. And the way that we do this is to increase public awareness, improve law enforcement efforts, access to resources, really looking at our anti-trafficking legislation and collaboration, which I hope you were able to see looking at the different initiatives that are currently happening within the state of Georgia and some of the most recent legislations that have either passed or been adopted or have been strengthened from previous legislation. So, I mean, as an incredibly complex issue with a myriad of contributing factors, of course, more research is needed to evaluate programs and policies that help reduce the factors that put people at risk. But generally speaking, the human trafficking market is fueled by really that relationship between supply, which is our victims, demand, which are our buyers, and distribution, which are our traffickers. And then that overall need and that overall demand for cheap labor and commercial sex of our society. And it's also sustained by the low cost, low risk, high reward elements that drive the traffickers to guarantee that supply that continues to be available because of the vulnerability and the systemic inequality and disparity and the harmful social norms that are created. Demand reduction and prevention is a growing conversation. There's a lot to learn. There's a lot to be discussed. There's a lot to dig into, and it's a conversation and a topic that really has not been delved into a lot. But my hope this morning is that I invoked some kind of thought into a different perspective by shifting your thought from looking at human trafficking as just a victimization to what does it really mean when human trafficking is organized crime, when human trafficking is seen as a business, when human trafficking is an illicit industry, when human trafficking is a market. And really hope that you are able to be inspired and be creative and innovative when you are developing strategies to end human trafficking, or at least create a more impactful response from the view of reduction in demand in the deterrent of buyers and traffickers. And with that, I will end with my contact information and turn it back over to our amazing host and Jill. Thank you all for your time, and I hope
we're not over yet, so don't go. We're having a couple questions. We did get some throughout through here. So if anyone is still on, if you have additional questions, type them in. We're going to stick around for a couple more minutes and put Michelle on the hot seat, but she is a super expert. So the first question was, is Article 5(9)(5) a Georgia statute law or a federal one?
it's actually international.
Oh,
yeah. So
that's from Bobby.
Yes. So when it was signed back in 2000, I believe the United States actually ratified in 2005. I believe the last time that I checked, there were 177 countries that actually signed on to it. And the reason why I went all the way to international is because when you're looking at international law and you're trying to do things on a coordinated and streamlined level, it really allows for everyone to have the same response and the same understanding of what is being obligated by the states that agree to the protocol. So yes, it is not just for states. It's not just national, it's not just for Georgia, it is actually international.
So the third option that was not listed. So we're interested to know what % of child victims are considered sex workers versus other types of trafficking. And then if there's a specific age group that is often targeted in CSEC.
So as far as the age group that is targeted in CSEC, it's usually between 12 and 15, but it can range. I've seen some numbers that have increased that range from 10 to 17. It really just depends on where you're pulling the numbers from and whether you're looking at it on a state level, a national level, or a global level, because obviously it will change. And I believe the second part of the question is the percentage
Yeah, that are sex trafficking versus more labor or other types of trafficking.
So approximately 1 in 4. It's about 21% of all trafficking, sexually exploited individuals, but it's about 1 in 4.
Okay, awesome. The other questions we had, so Ellie had a couple questions as well. She's wondering, does the safe harbor law also assess the companies producing pornography online or just to operate a brick and mortar facility?
I'll be honest, I am not 100% sure, but I believe that it is just the physical brick and mortar venues. However, I would be glad to go back and check and provide a more short answer for Ellie.
Okay. And then we're curious if that data clearinghouse is available to the public.
So the data clearinghouse is actually available to the members of the coalition. However, the data within it can be requested. But I will say that the data clearinghouse is also, it's a fairly new program. There is information within it. The information is limited because the Georgia Coalition to Combat Human Trafficking was a project as of 2019. It really kicked off last year, and the data clearinghouse happened within that time period. So there is data in it, and it's definitely growing as we try more cases and we're getting more information from the different partners of the task force, but eventually it's going to be in a place where other partners and other agencies are able to access that data, maybe not directly through the clearinghouse, but can request it knowing that the data exists.
Awesome. And so I know you can speak to this question. What % of children are considered sex workers versus being trafficked, which implies voluntary? And I know we believe that children developmentally cannot make that decision. Can you speak to that, Michelle?
So I honestly don't know that there is a percentage of youth that are like that number is being tracked. And that is just my personal knowledge, just because we usually agree that a youth cannot consent to being trafficked. However, the only distinction that I could really think of is when you're thinking about the LGBTQ population, when there's that comparison between the survival sex and the exploitation of their non-LGBTQ friends, if that makes sense.
Yes. And the next question, Bobby is asking, are the different types of trafficking prosecuted differently? So for example, sex trafficking versus labor trafficking.
Are the different types of trafficking prosecuted differently? Do you mean, can you expound on that just a little bit? On that question, Bobby?
She means maybe, so for a perpetrator, like a pimp for sex trafficking versus someone who is, so Bobby's asking the penalty.
Let's see. So I know that we have recently increased penalties and had harsher penalties. but I'm not 100% sure the answer to that question. Jill, you are on mute.
Sorry. Yeah, and I know the Georgia legislator has done a lot of change over, the recent years when it comes to prosecuting on the different types of trafficking, specifically CSEC as well. So that is something that is an ever-changing target as well. And I wanted to ask you one final question before we wrap up. Are there any big legislation that we should look out for in the 2022 session at the state level or federally?
So I have heard that there are thoughts about really looking at whether or not to adopt other models of when it comes to criminalization or decriminalization or the regulation of prostitution and sex work. And there are conversations that could happen around that, but I can't really say with any certainty whether or not those are actually coming down. But I know there's always conversation and thought about different ways that we can address human trafficking.
And then last
But
question.
I haven't heard anything specifically.
Yeah, it's kind of like that in between where legislative agendas are maybe coming out like October, November. So to see a little bit more there. And then I was just putting some links in we had a senior student. So there's a senior in human services at the University of North Georgia, and they wanted to work in sexually trafficked juveniles. How can they get involved, get trained, and potentially land a career working with this population and being of service? Do you have any kind of tips or starting points? I'm putting a couple websites in the question right now for them, but I would love to hear what you think.
Honestly, I'd probably connect with someone at DJJ or potentially Youth Spark. I know those are agencies that work with juveniles that are youth. And a lot of times they come into contact with juveniles who have experienced CSEC victimization. So I would reach out to someone within DJJ, and I would also reach out to Youth Spark, which is a nonprofit that works with juveniles as well.
Yeah, and I also put in there the new One Response team. So the Child Advocacy Centers of Georgia, who lead a lot of that response, and just starting with, internships, any collaborative groups, things like that. So I really wanted to thank you, Michelle, so much for coming on and lending your expertise. We had lots of inquiries for slides and everything like that. So hopefully you can give us some update soon. And if not the slides, then give us a couple links that will send us to this information as well. But we really, really appreciate your time. I've put the evaluation link in the chat box a couple times for you guys. It's going to be the same one for all of day one. You can fill it out now or at the end. It's going to ask you to fill out a separate one for each session that you're going to. So either way that you want to do it. And we will see you at the 9:40 sessions. Not the 10:40 is our next session. So I'll give everyone a quick break in there. So thank you everyone so much. Have a great one.
Thank you so much. Have a good day.